This video will be part 1 of my coverage of Abraham Maslow's transpersonal psychology for PSY 230 personality theory. Many students come to Maslow in the motivation chapter in their introductory psychology course and become pretty immediately familiar with the hierarchy of needs. They often are surprised when they take this class that there is more to Maslow's work than just the hierarchy of needs, although his motivational theory is sort of critical to and central to his work. Maslow has a rich kind of viewpoint, not a perfect theory by any stretch, but he brings in, as he was quoted saying, I am a Freudian, I am behavioristic, I am humanistic. He brings this rich kind of viewpoint, taking into considerations inner dynamics, learning, including social learning, but also he's very strong in his belief that human beings are resilient, that they are capable of growth throughout the lifespan. So he is also bringing in very humanistic ideas as well. A little bit of Maslow's personal history. He was born in New York. His family is from Russian Jewish extraction. He was the child of immigrants, and that immigrant experience certainly was formative for him. Part of why he sees people as having these basic needs that have to be met before you can move on to things like spiritual growth or psychological growth is because of that immigrant experience that his family had. He studied, originally he was studying music and drama at the City College of New York. He was an urban creature. He was very much into that city life, and his early interests were in music and drama. But he became interested in experimental psychology over time and went to kind of the hub of experimental work, which was in the large Midwestern land-grant universities at that time. So he transferred to Wisconsin, where he studied experimental psychology that was primarily behavioral in orientation. So his early training in psychology was definitely in radical behavioral tradition, including both associative learning, classical conditioning theory, and operant conditioning theory. He worked with Thorndike, who is a theorist that we don't cover in this class, but if you took a comprehensive learning or cognition course, you would run into Thorndike's work. He worked with him at Columbia, where he was a student as well. He then moved on. He came back to his roots. He taught at Brooklyn College, which would be considered today a community-type college. So he was working with a very diverse student body, primarily in 2-year programs. And he worked there for quite a while, just really watching and observing and learning from these students who were often overcoming a lot of basic hurdles in order to pursue their education. So I think that experience was formative for him. During both his time in college and in graduate school, while it wasn't his primary interest, he did study the basic Freudian theorists, like Adler and Fromm and Horney. You've studied Adler and Horney, and you'll see in his theory, like we did with Carl Rogers, the influence of people like Adler and Horney, who have sort of a practical bent to their approach, but also a deeply social bent, where you cannot extract people from the social nature of their lives. He also studied cultural anthropology, and that's something he has in common with Erik Erikson. Vertimer and Benedict were particularly influential. He was sensitive to the fact that there were cultural differences, although it has to be said that his approach has been criticized for being very deeply grounded in Western cultural tradition and assumptions. And I'll talk about that more when we get into the nitty-gritty of the theory. His interest dramatically shifted in the direction of personality and social psychology after World War II. And he was not alone in this. There were many experimental psychologists who found themselves needing to study why the Holocaust happened and the impact of those kinds of events on the human psyche. So he really started thinking more deeply about human motivation and human personality after that time. He taught at Brandeis for a period of time. He was, like Carl Rogers, like B.F. Skinner, and many of the other psychologists we've talked about in this course, he was a leader in the psychology community. He was elected president of the APA in 1967. That was a time when he was also really putting down the details of his full theory. His book, Toward a Psychology of Being, which was published in 1968, is basically the document that articulates his theoretical point of view. Unfortunately, he died fairly young, at 62, of a heart attack. Now, as I mentioned, for most of you, your introduction to Maslow has been through the hierarchy of needs, usually in the motivation and emotion chapter in an introductory psychology class. So let's just get ourselves back into the hierarchy.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory in psychology. It argues that there are 5 stages of human needs that motivate our behavior. Abraham Maslow proposed his theory in 1943 after studying what he called exemplary people, such as Albert Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt. First, there are physiological needs, such as the need to breathe, eat, drink, or sleep. The moment we get enough of that and we feel awake and our bellies are full, we get motivated by the next thing. Now we want safety. We try to earn money, build up resources, and look for shelter that protects us against dangers. Once we are satisfied and feel safe, we have time to think about what we want next. At stage 3, we seek love and belonging. We desire to be close to family and friends, belong to a society, or join a gang. But the moment we feel completely part of a group, we already wish to be a little different than the rest. At stage 4, we look for esteem, self-confidence, and respect from our peers. We want to be someone. If we have money, we buy a fancy watch. If we have a brain, we write or think or work a lot. Motivation to perform and compete is now at its highest. Students, sportsmen, and inventors excel. Neil Armstrong even flew to the moon. Only if we breathe and drink and eat and sleep enough, and we feel safe and part of a group and still special, only then can we reach level 5, self-actualization. Now we can relax, be creative, accept facts for what they are, give back or do whatever we want. No more pressure, unless of course there is trouble below. If you are a leader and believe in the theory, use it. First, make sure everyone has eaten well. Then make them feel safe and help them belong to a group. Once they feel they belong, they are ready to stand out and excel. Thanks for watching. Even if we try to keep it short, each video is quite some work. Maslow.
So, to echo what the creator of that video said, Maslow makes some clear assumptions. Notice the order. At the base, physiological needs. And there's a reason why you select this triangular shape. It's assumed that there are building blocks when we're functioning. We cannot deal with the higher level needs until we have our physiological needs and our safety needs met. We can't deal with our basic psychological needs for belonging, for love, for esteem, and recognition until we've met those basic lower needs. He argued that you had to, you had, there are times in people's lives when, if their physiological and their safety issues are challenged, they kind of drop back from the psychological needs and they have to deal with the now. Think about when people are in a natural disaster. What's popping into my mind are, the fires that have occurred in California and Colorado. When people are called upon to evacuate, they have to run. They throw whatever they can in their vehicles. They're not thinking about their self-actualization needs. They're not necessarily even thinking about self-esteem and love and belonging. They're just thinking about their basic physiological needs and the need to be safe. Now, when those things are met, Maslow assumes that you can move on to psychological needs. He believed that friendship, intimacy, family connection, a sense of being loved and belonging were more basic than needs for self-esteem and status and recognition. Now, there are similarities here between Rogers and Maslow. While Rogers didn't necessarily talk about safety and physiological needs, he definitely talked about love and belongingness needs and esteem needs. So in Rogers' theory, you have the need for positive regard and the need for positive self-regard. And those are kind of wrapped up in what Maslow is describing as esteem and love and belongingness needs. We'll talk more about what self-actualization actually is, but for now, what I need you to understand is that the order matters. And Maslow assumes that you have to satisfy one before you can move on to the others. So he starts with what he referred to as biological deficiency needs, and that word deficiency matters a great deal. He assumed, and I want you to think about when those times when your physiological needs aren't being met. Like if you're hungry, what you're experiencing is a deficiency of calories. And your body, you start thinking about food, you start thinking about how hungry you are. You're in a deficiency state and you need to make up for what is missing. So with both the physiological needs and the safety needs, the assumption is that we experience pain and discomfort when we are in a deficiency state. That pain and discomfort is going to motivate us to reduce the deficiency by meeting the need. So if you're hungry, you become motivated to eat. If you are thirsty, you become motivated to drink water. If your safety is threatened, you are motivated to move towards safety. If you don't have shelter, you're motivated to move towards shelter. I'm thinking of sort of the people in Ukraine right now who have been forced to flee their homes. I saw a video of families that were basically living in the subways, in the tunnels, trying to cobble together space that was both safe and could allow them to meet some, although not well, some of their physiological needs. So they're deficiency states. When you are suffering from a deficiency state, the motivation is to satisfy the need to make that pain or that discomfort go away. There are also psychological deficiency needs, and again, that word deficiency matters. When we experience a lack of satisfaction of these basic psychological needs, what we experience is discomfort or pain. Like the biological needs, think of safety needs, for example. Those families that were fleeing their homes in Ukraine, they're experiencing fear and terror because their lives are being threatened. That fear and terror is very uncomfortable, so they are motivated to move to a safer location, right? On the psychological sides, when we're talking about belongingness and love needs, think about a time when you have felt very lonely, or you felt excluded from a group. Though what you feel is, in terms of the exclusion or the sense of loneliness, you feel discomfort. What you feel is pain. So you are in a deficiency state. What do you become motivated to do when you feel lonely? You reach out to other people so that those needs for connection are being satisfied. When you feel that you've been excluded, you seek out connection in order to no longer feel excluded. For the esteem needs, when we feel like we have failed, so think of a time when you felt like you failed, that's a hit to your esteem, and it pushes you into a deficiency state. From a motivational standpoint, what happens? You become motivated to either defend, so make yourself feel like you didn't actually fail, or you are motivated to try harder in order to demonstrate your competency, or you present yourself with a new challenge and move in a different direction where you are successful and you feel solid sense of self-esteem in that situation. Now, the being needs are not deficiency needs. They are, in fact, the type of need that comes from restlessness, from the need to grow. So it's a different kind of motivational state with the being needs that are at the top of the pyramid. And he referred to these as self-actualization needs. And what's happening, in comparison to the biological and psychological deficiency needs, which psychologically what you're experiencing is discomfort based on something that is missing. With the being needs, those other needs are met. Your body's comfortable, you're safe, you're not lonely, you belong, you have a community, and you feel pretty good about yourself. You may still feel restless, and that can motivate the need to expand, the need to learn something new, the need to explore, to seek, and so on. So what self-actualization needs actually cause is us to seek out challenge, which momentarily can actually make you uncomfortable. So, think about a time when you've had to learn a very new skill. And, you're leaving your comfort zone and you're in an uncomfortable position on purpose in order to learn something new. It is expansive. It is growth related. So these being needs mean putting yourself intentionally in a position where you may feel anxious, you may feel incompetent, you may feel that you're struggling, but it's for the purpose of growth. So the self-actualization needs may mean making yourself purposefully uncomfortable in service of expansion, in service of discovering, like Rogers, Maslow believed in inherent potentials, things you're born with that you need to work hard to discover. So being needs are essentially very different from the deficiency needs. Deficiency needs, you just want to fill the gap so that you stop feeling uncomfortable. With the being needs, you want to feel uncomfortable so that you will grow. So to revisit some of the rules of the hierarchy of needs, each need is what's called prepotent, meaning that you have to address the basic biological needs. So biological needs, then safety needs. Those have to be met before you can meet the psychological needs for belonging and esteem. And those needs have to be met before you can deal with actualization needs. Now, this assumption is not without its critics. For example, I mentioned the footage that I've watched over the last weeks from Ukraine, and sometimes those videos show the incredible resilience of people. For instance, down in the subways, there have been videos that have surfaced of families hunkered down in this really hostile environment where they're under constant threat. Their safety needs are not being fully met, and their basic biological needs for food and for water and for other basic biological necessities are not being fully met. However, they were coming together with other people to establish their sense of belongingness, and they were also engaging in activities that were growth related, making songs, writing poetry, telling stories, engaging with children, which you could argue were meeting the range of psychological needs as well as some transpersonal needs for at the peak of the hierarchy. And we'll come back to that criticism in a later point in the presentation. So his assumption is the basic needs have to be met before less critical survival needs are met. So just to reinforce this idea, psychological needs like love and belonging, physiological needs have to be dealt with. The assumption is that if you are too hungry or too afraid, dealing with love and belongingness isn't so important. If your love and belongingness aren't being met, self-actualization isn't quite so critical. So how did Maslow define self-actualization? What is it and what isn't it? And that's really kind of our next challenge, is to figure out what is it. Self-actualization is a concept that is frequently misdefined. And we need to be careful that we understand it better. So in this cartoon, I do miss Calvin and Hobbes quite a lot. Calvin, being his fairly narcissistic self, he is a child, that's expected. Nothing I do is my fault, my family is dysfunctional, my parents want to empower me, consequently I'm not self-actualized. My behavior is addictive functioning in a disease process of toxic codependency. I need holistic healing and wellness before I accept any responsibility for my actions. One of us needs his head in a bucket of ice water. Hobbes is reminding Calvin that, you know what, you're in pretty good shape. So let's talk about what self-actualization actually is and what it isn't. Maslow defines self-actualization in terms of that sound a lot like Carl Rogers. So Maslow and Rogers are in agreement that people come into the world with a unique set of capacities, potential abilities, talents. He assumed that people were inherently unique, and if their other needs are met, they can engage in intentional investigation of what those needs, what those capacities, talents, and potentialities are. He based this on his investigation of people he felt were exceptional, and he argued that these were all people who tended to invest incredible amounts of energy and be highly motivated to explore what they were good at, explore what they were capable of, and they tended to push their limits hard in order to do that growth-related work. So he saw self-actualization as a process where you are engaging in digging around in your inner closet of things that you can do to continue to grow. So unlike Freud, he believed that across the lifespan, people continue to push themselves to become more than what they currently are. And really that's the essence of self-actualization. So what are self-actualized people like? First, and this comes from his study of self-actualized people, and you can criticize the science because it's not a particularly scientific study. He selected a group of well-known people and studied their documents. He also selected some peers who he felt were accomplished self-actualized people and sought to document their traits and capacities, their characteristics. So what we would consider this now would be a kind of, for people who were already not living, a kind of psychological autopsy, but more a biographical sketch looking for patterns of traits and characteristics. He argued that people at the peak of their abilities saw life with clarity, meaning they tended to be realists. They tended to have a certain amount of stoicism. They also saw themselves with particular clarity. As a result, he described self-actualized people as more objective, more realistic, and less likely to be fanciful, and less vulnerable to having their ego defenses kind of go out of orbit and distort their ability to see the world clearly. So you're starting to get a picture here of a particular kind of life, and a particular set of personality characteristics that he saw as relevant to self-actualization. He also saw self-actualizing people as being very purposeful with their work, whatever form that work takes. Like Alfred Adler, Maslow really saw work as a significant component of personality. So did Freud. Adler put it in a more central position in theory. Freud talked about the ability to love and work being essential to human experience. For Maslow, he didn't disagree with either Adler or Freud in that people need, and they pull a lot of their psychological needs from vocation, from work. And he's not just talking about paid labor here. It could be, in any sphere that you identify as work. And that includes kind of hobby work. He also argued that self-actualized people tended to have commitments in their belief system that encouraged them to break away from kind of narcissistic interests. He believed that people who were kind of stuck at the level of psychological deficiency needs tended to be too self-focused. So he argued that self-actualized people tended to be other-focused and believe in things that matter outside of just themselves. So, it wasn't just about their own successes and their narcissistic interests. These were people who had a value system, and they put their work and their energy, their skills and their talents into causes, for example, that would last beyond their existence. Finally, he described major characteristics of people who are self-actualizing in 4 basic categories. And when we come back in the next part of the lecture, I'll be talking about them in more detail. But for now, excuse me, he assumed that people who are self-actualizing, so they've met their basic biological deficiency needs and they continue to do so. They've met their basic psychological needs and they continue to do so. Now, when they're self-actualizing, what do they look like? They tend to be creative people, not just artistically creative, but creative in general. And remember, Rogers pointed to that, so did Alfred Adler. They tend to be spontaneous. Rogers mentioned the same thing. They tend to be courageous, and they tend to work hard. Those last two, courage and hard work, hit real strong notes of Adler. So what you're seeing here is some connections between Maslow's work, the work of Carl Rogers, and the work of Alfred Adler kind of shining through in this concept of self-actualized or self-actualization. And that concludes part 1 of my coverage of Abraham Maslow's transpersonal psychology.